You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast presented by Coravin. Coravin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without having to pop the cork. As always, I'm joined by Billy Galanko. Get into anything crazy this weekend?
No, nothing crazy, but I did have two fun wine experiences. So the first one is actually going to lead to a recommendation. So it's worth listening to my little preamble here for our listeners. But we went to a free outdoor line dancing concert thing in downtown Los Angeles. Turns out line dancing just means dancing in a line. Doesn't necessarily relate 100% to country music, which is interesting. This was a kind of this music center downtown where they have concerts, symphonies and stuff like that. But they have this big outdoor area. And my now wife had done line dancing lessons for a bachelorette party one time in Nashville. So she's like, oh, this could be fun. So we go, and it was they were playing techno, some country songs, but remixes of them. And it was the most high-speed, complex line dancing I've ever seen. And it was also, they wouldn't let you expand out of a certain area. So it was just thousands of people crammed in this little box. And I'm not nearly coordinated enough not to run into people. So it was pretty intense. But what I'm getting to with that is, so there are all these people out there kind of line dancing, everybody coming from all over the city. It's free, but then they have wines. They have a little table you can go get beer, wines, and spirits. And I guess it was from the Symphony Hall next door. So they actually had a pretty interesting selection, old world, new world. But they had an Australian Grenache. And I think I've mentioned it on here before, the High Sands by a company called Yungara. I had a 2010 High Sands. It's one of my favorite wines of all time. So when I'm in the line there, they had a bottling from Yungara, actually. It was a low intervention, so not filtered 2017 Yungara Grenache that was grown nearby where one of my favorite wines ever was grown, similar vineyard. So I was, this is amazing. So I got that, and we had it in a little plastic cup, and it was still fantastic. It was like, this is why I like Yungara. Everybody should be getting this. Why is nobody else getting this? I'm like,
why is everyone dancing?
Yeah. I was like, this is so good. So that was exciting. So if anybody's looking for good McLaren Vale Australian wine, check out Yungara. They make Shiraz as well as Grenache. Yungara is spelled Yangarra. Great producer. They make great wines. And then Saturday, I was watching the latest Vias for Vino episode. I highly recommend everybody check out the Lebanon episode. Really cool. Great episode. I only got halfway through, and it's still, I think, is one of my favorite ones in the last few. I was comparing to Sauvignon. So one I had actually used as an exam wine a month ago plus. Then I had Coravin, and I tasted it then, and I wanted to see what it was like now. And then I opened another one from a different producer who is known for making more of a big style. So the one that I had on my exam was Domaine Moines. I don't know how to pronounce it as well in French. It's Moines. And it was from the Roche Chamoine. I think it's a sub-appellation within Sauvignon. So Sauvignon and then Roche Chamoine. And it's a mother-daughter duo. And that one was amazing. It's everything you want in a Sauvignon. A little bit oxidized, that bruised apple notes, high acid. Just a really great Chenin. The chamomile you get in the Chenin. It's a really expressive, great Chenin, slowly fermented over a long period of time. And then I had another one from the Famille or Joly, which everybody knows Joly, Joly, is one of the most famous Domaine Nicolas Joly, but they also have two labels. It's one of the most famous Sauvignon producers. He has a bunch of single plots wines and just basically some of the most famous wines in all of Sauvignon. I had one that was kind of further down the hill. If you see Sauvignon, it's like a hill appellation that was made more by his daughter, which is why it's under the Famille label. But it was really interesting because this is a completely different style, super late pick. So its alcohol was 14 plus, super ripe. And I think they actually put some new oak on it. I think I read that, which is not as common for Sauvignon. So one was super lean, like what you would expect. Not necessarily super lean because Sauvignon still has body. But the other one was absolutely enormous, a big boy, a highly fleshed Sauvignon. So I knew that was going to be the case, which is why I had saved them, and it was cool. And the Coravin worked perfectly. It tasted just like it had on the other one on day one. So that was great.
So now is the acceptable term for full-bodied, highly fleshed now? That's
So
my post father body is highly fleshed, not fat. Highly fleshed.
Yeah, I guess full body would be the term. I think if I ever am back on an exam and I write highly fleshed, people might be a little confused. But I wanted to
it's okay.
I guess the body for the domaine Amoin or Amoin was medium plus. To me, Sauvignon tends to be a bigger body anyway. So I wanted to be like, it took Sauvignon a step further. It's normally really well balanced with acid and minerality and some other oxidized flavors that kind of give it some roundness. This just had so much roundness from being late picked and the higher alcohol and the barrel. It was very interesting. If it was the first Sauvignon I've ever had, I probably wouldn't like Sauvignon as much as I do. It was just a little plush. Maybe that's what I was going for, but it was still really cool. Great producer, made wine, just not necessarily my style. Definitely prefer the Domaine Amoin.
Yeah. He was a nice guy, funny, smart. Wouldn't bring him home.
Yeah, he's a little over
that matter.
A little over the top. Yeah,
a little loud at dinner.
What's the saying? A little extra. Yeah.
Slam the doors when they go through rooms. Things like that.
Yeah, but so beyond that, we've now buried our lead once again. I got to speak with one of, to me, is an LA local wine celebrity. He's actually a wine insider, person I've always wanted to speak with, just in the industry in general. This week for our interview, Abe Schoener.
Yeah, I wasn't able to get on the actual interview portion, but anytime you can uncover someone who is maybe, I guess, in that stage where they only do life's work type projects, that based on how you've described Abe, that is what comes to mind. Someone who's not piddling around at all. They're only working on things that they find of infinite importance, which I think is interesting when you apply that to the wine space.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great way to put it. He's definitely following his passions. You can look up a more complete bio, but I'll give the TLDR. Is basically he used to be a professor on the East Coast. He taught philosophy, came out to the West Coast, worked to harvest as an intern at Stag's Leap, and then fell in love with winemaking. And since then, he basically, that was the late 90s, threw himself into winemaking, but through the philosophical mindset, always questioning how things are done, trying to let things find their own way. And he got known for a little while just working with really old and interesting vineyards up in Napa and Sonoma, and then making those wines in very low intervention style, trying to test all the norms, break all the norms. When he ended up making really cool wines, got a little bit of not just a hipster following, but a really kind of cult following around his project. It was called Scholium Project. That was his company that he was running. And over the years, that had led him down here to Los Angeles. I think it was maybe during the pandemic or a little bit before, he got really interested in making wine from old vineyards down in Southern California, where I am. And we get into it a little bit there. And I think we've talked about it in the past, but before winemaking moved up to Northern California, down here was basically the hub of winemaking. And I was reading something recently that even said after World War II, there were still more vineyards in San Bernardino County, which is just east of here, than there were in Napa and Sonoma combined after World War II. So that was still not too long ago. So what he had done is he's come down here. They started the Los Angeles River Wine Company, and he works with a small team, and they've identified vineyards both east of here, so an area called Rancho Cucamonga, which was actually one of the earliest planted areas for vineyards outside of Los Angeles proper. And I can touch on something on that in a second. But then they also source grapes from a vineyard closer to Temecula. And these are all very old vineyards. Most of them planted if over 100 years ago. He talks about the exact age in there. A lot of them on their own roots. And they basically have just been sourcing this fruit and trying to make really wines of place, and just basically to tell the story of these unique vineyards down here in Southern California. So we really spend most of our episode just talking about that and his philosophy on why those specific vineyards are interesting, what varieties they grow, and how they came to be.
Very cool. I hope our listeners enjoy the episode. It's I had a few people now on from the LA wine scene, and as soon as I find those folks here on the East Coast, we'll have them as well. And someone's in the Midwest and a wine savant living in the flyover states, send them our way.
Yeah, for sure. But before our interview, I wanted to mention that the book that we've probably plugged the most, Hugh Johnson's Story of Wine, I was listening to that and it got to the late, I guess, 1800s, but the time period around California when these wines were here, got to their California chapter. And he mentioned this vineyard that was growing on the banks of the LA River, had this really big tree. It was called the El Aliso Vineyard, and that's what they actually called the tree, El Aliso. And it was one of the earliest vineyards around LA. And it turns out that on my way to the gym, I drive by the exact location of that former giant tree and the vineyard every day. There's a plaque on the road that I literally drive by.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was so neat. So you never know, at least in LA, all the winemaking history around you. And it's really neat. We touch on a little bit of that in the podcast too.
Awesome. That's a great segue. Before we get into Abe's interview, a word from our partner, Corvin, to remember if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, use one of the Corvin systems. It'll be your best friend. You can visit corvin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off your purchase of any of their devices. And if you're a member of the trade, you can go to trade.corvin.com for exclusive discounts on all of their products. And without further ado, here is Abe Schoener.
Hi, Abe. Thanks so much for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been excited to chat with you kind of one-on-one ever since I've read about you and gone to your tastings with Raj a couple of years ago, actually. So I wanted to dive right in and ask a deeper nerdy question right off the bat here and talk about more beyond the age of a grapevine itself. People always think about old vines having an impact on wines, but they don't really think about maybe the vineyard itself as a macro living organism or the time it's spent over history and how it's been tended in the general area. Can you talk a little bit about your perspectives on that and how it impacts the way wine tastes today?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. What I'd like to say to give you a little bit of background is that we're presently working with about 4 or 5 vineyards in Cucamonga, depending on how you count them. And the youngest vineyard we've ever worked with in Cucamonga was planted in 1930. Most of them were planted right before Prohibition, 1912 to 1918. We also have another vineyard planted about 1896 in Temecula on the Pechanga Reservation. And that's the one that really offers the most interesting way to get into your question. And so what I would like to point to, something that is really uncommon in modern vineyards that are well farmed, and that is that our vineyard in Temecula has an animal burrow underneath almost every single vine. The vines are all of them, about 130 years old, with some interesting exceptions of vines that have grown up spontaneously in the vineyard. The new ones that have grown up spontaneously are really easy to tell from the original one planted in 1896 because they're so much smaller and they have a different structure. The young vines don't tend to have burrows, but the vines that date to 1896, almost every single one of them has a hole leading to an animal burrow underneath. And some of the burrows are so big that they look like they're possible coyote homes. Other ones are so small that they're probably for some kind of ground squirrel, but it's absolutely amazing. So now imagine a vine whose trunk is so thick that it looks a little bit like a tree, maybe a trunk 8 inches across with 6 to 10 sprawling arms and the ability to support maybe as many as 40 clusters during harvest. The vine that I have in mind that's on the edge of the vineyard has a hole underneath the vine that is so big that a small child would crawl into it. In most modern vineyards, any kind of animal interference with the roots is understood as something that's pernicious and that is going to diminish the health of the vines and in some way bring down the wine quality. And what we see in this vineyard is, instead of that, a kind of symbiosis that is completely unforeseen. And not just the kind of symbiosis that people are learning more about with organic and regenerative farming, where there's a symbiosis, for instance, between soil microbes and the vines. but we're seeing some kind of symbiosis between large mammals and the grapevines. Now, you asked how that affects the taste of the wine, and I think we don't have a fucking clue. We have no idea. We haven't done anything like an experiment to control for the taste of wines made from grapes that have come off vines that have burrows versus the vines that don't have burrows. But instead, what we see is a really special, noble wine coming off this vineyard that has roughly, say, 700 grapevines in it and 500 burrows.
That's so interesting. So that again is an interesting part that I guess I wasn't even considering when I first asked the question is, do you think part of what makes that vineyard special in the wines that come off that maybe is the fact that it was less tended, or what was it tended since it's been planted, or did it have a time of kind of neglect and it's come back to attention?
So I think that it's unlikely that anybody anywhere in the world would have allowed 70% of the grapevines to develop large animal burrows if it had been tended in a constant and careful way. So the vineyard was in fact largely abandoned for 60 to 70 years. The present owner inherited it from his grandfather. I think it was his great-grandfather who planted it. And he's about 70 years old himself, and he thinks that the vineyard stopped being tended when he was around 5 or 6 years old. So there's 4 really large oak trees that are in the middle of the vineyard and that have knocked out perhaps as many as 100 vines between the 4 of them. And he recalls those trees being about his own height when he was about maybe 10 years old. So he thinks that means that the vineyard stopped being cared for when he was around 4 or 5 or 6, something like that. And so when we first saw the vineyard in 2019, you could tell that some of the grapevines had been tended somewhat recently. There had been attempts to train and to prune the vines, and that might have accounted for 30% of the vines in the vineyard. But that means that the remaining 70% had no visible signs of having been tended or trained. They were sprawling for the most part, some of them climbing up in the oak trees. As we got to know the vineyard better, and in particular, when we came back in the winter after 2019 to prune the vineyard, we discovered that there was a large section of the vineyard, maybe accounting for about a quarter of it by surface area, with no pruning cuts. It was very hard to distinguish individual grapevines in the vineyard because they were so completely intertwined. And as we began to make our first pruning cuts to gradually bring back some kind of shape, you might even say discipline to the grapevines, what we noticed was there were no visible wounds on any of the existing wood. And that really fits with what the owner of the vineyard said, namely that section of the vineyard hadn't been pruned at all in 70 years.
Wow, that's crazy. Can you talk a little bit about the varieties that you're working with there, or have you done like testing, or does he know what they were?
So he does not know. When we asked him what was growing there, he shrugged. The vineyard is a kind of curiosity for him and for the people on the land surrounding it. And all of them have a kind of sentimental attachment to it because the owner's name is Bob Manoa, because Bob's grandfather asked him to preserve the vineyard. What they have done by way of preserving it is simply not to rip it out. They haven't engaged in farming it themselves. And I think that they're really happy for the attention that we give it. When we asked him really basic questions like what it's planted to, he truly shrugged. He said, I don't know. It makes red wine. Mostly we don't make any wine from it at all. But anytime that we've tried to make wine, you get a kind of, I think he said a light red wine, or maybe he might even have used the word pink. Mm-hmm. We scraped together 6 samples for genetic testing in 2019. And we haven't done it again since then, just for lack of funds. But we really look forward to doing it soon, maybe next year. The 6 samples we took from 6 vines that were as morphologically different from each other as we could find, with completely different cluster morphology, different clusters or different colors of the grapes on the clusters. And what we got back was complete uniformity and 100% Listan Prieto.
Mm-hmm.
Is in a way not surprising, because the grape that's widely called Mission in California, called Pais in a lot of Central and South America, but also has maybe 20 other local synonyms. We have known for, I think, roughly 20 years that that grape variety is descended from Listan Prieto, but we've also known for almost the same amount of time that there's almost no pure Listan Prieto in the New World anymore, because when the vines were originally planted, they were allowed to sexually reproduce, and cuttings that were the offspring of the sexual reproduction were then propagated. But there's almost no such thing as pure Listan Prieto in the United States. One of the stories about this vineyard, and by the way, we call the vineyard Lone Wolf. That's a story in itself, but just for ease of reference, one of the stories about Lone Wolf is that when it was planted, the two men who planted it went back to Spain to get cuttings. That would be very, very atypical for Southern California vineyard propagation in the 1890s. Almost all propagation was made by taking cuttings from a neighbor's vineyard. Sometimes the cuttings came from a nursery, mostly on the East Coast, but I think by the 1890s, there were also nurseries, perhaps in California, but I think in Texas, for instance. Anyway, the cuttings would not have come directly from the Old World, but the genetic analysis that we've done suggests that when the vineyard was planted, it might have been planted to 100% Listan Prieto with Old World cuttings. We still see so much diversity in the vineyard that, based on our own kind of casual ampelography, we think that it's possible that there's also Grenache in the vineyard, and also possible that there is Zinfandel. Zinfandel would be not the least bit surprising, but we really can't be sure about any of that. And I would say it's fair to say that as the fruit ripens, in most years, nothing looks like Grenache or Zinfandel, and everything looks pretty crazy the way that Listan Prieto tends to in the New World.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. So we've had Amanda Barnes on recently to talk about South American wines and Criolla or Criollo Pais, and then the different variations of that down there. So, and then I've been reading a lot about like just California wine history. I do think people don't. I was listening to a book today that said after World War II, the most grapevine plantings for commercial use were actually still in San Bernardino County, not up in Napa. That's obviously not Napa, but Napa Sonoma, thanks to Prohibition. But I don't think I realized how much Pais and Mission and Listan Prieto was planted even later in the 1800s. Like even after more varieties came, I think it remained the workhorse. And it produced, like you said, could produce really, really fine wines.
It for sure was the workhorse in Southern California. I know mostly about the area around Los Angeles, and I think it was a very long time before Zinfandel outstripped Listan Prieto or Pais as the most planted grape variety. You probably know this, that for most of its history, at least in the United States, the grape variety was not respected. Even some of the people who planted a lot of it thought that it was really of secondary quality. And I have no idea what the plantings and what the farming was like then in such a way that could lead to a difference in quality. But we find in the Lone Wolf vineyard, with these really old grapevines, we find a very, very high level of quality. And it's possible that the biggest reason for that is because of their age. Maybe it's a grape variety that when the vines are young, really only produces medium good fruit. That seems entirely possible. On the other hand, I don't think anybody talks that way about the Listan Prieto, for instance, in the Canary Islands. For sure, the old vines are respected, maybe more respected, but I don't think anybody ever says, oh, when the vineyard is only 10 years old, you can't make serious wine. I don't think anybody speaks that way.
Yeah. And something I recently found out more about Jean-Louis Vigna, who made wine here in LA. He was raised in Bordeaux, and his vineyard was 100% planted to mission. And his wines were actually well respected. Like, they're considered better than other local wines, and even by people who thought they like knew wines back in the 1800s. So I thought that was interesting. Same grape, maybe just using different techniques, maybe not fermenting in like a cowhide and some other things. But can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the wine that you make, that Lone Wolf wine, and then where you're actually making the wine? Because I do want to touch on, and I think a lot of our listeners will want to know a little bit more about making wine in LA. And it turns out actually that El Aliso Vineyard, I go to the gym in the Arts District. So I actually drive by where that original winery was and the tree that used to be there every day. I had no idea. And now I pointed out to my fiance or my wife now that this is where the first winery in LA was.
It's truly incredible. The history of winemaking in Los Angeles is incredible on its own, but it is also incredible how little is known about it. And there's so many traces of it, but they're only traces. So there are at least half dozen names of 19th century winemakers that are street names in Los Angeles. The first place that we made wine in LA was in a part of town that's called North Chinatown or something like that. And the building we were in was the intersection of Willhard and Nod. And both Willhard and Nod were grape growers and winemakers. Vineyards, of course. Mateo Street is named for Matthew Keller, who was one of the big grape growers. It's truly amazing. The place where we make wine now and where we really hope to stay for a long time is in between, it's close to Alameda on Dean Street. And it's in a building which is very common for Los Angeles because it's such a new city. It's the only building that's ever stood at this location. And it was built in 1912. Before it was this building, which is a very large warehouse with 3 floors, it was a lumber yard. Before it was a lumber yard, it was a vineyard. It was a vineyard until 1905. So we're making wine in a building built in 1912. It's at exactly the same location as an original vineyard in Los Angeles until 1905. There are railroad tracks outside, and the railroad tracks, in a way, explain the vanishing of the vineyards. Once the railroads connected Los Angeles to the north and to the east, all the agricultural land became too valuable and was turned into warehouse space and manufacturing space. And at that point, the vineyards started moving east, mostly to Cucamonga. Cucamonga, I think, had been planted as early as maybe the 1850s, but there were not a lot of grapes out there until 1905, when vineyards like the one where our building is were being uprooted and turned into warehouses.
Yeah. I was refreshing in preparation for this call. I can't remember his first name, but Tapia first planted his vineyard out in Cucamonga in 1839, like early 1840s. And that was the very start, obviously. And then that's really interesting. So as I also used to work for the Rebeli family, and what's interesting is that winery is still there, but the matriarch actually met her husband driving a tractor, and that was like in Pasadena. And it was just like, it's such an interesting thing to picture, like all of East Los Angeles, and it's like slowly moving back further and further where the vines were or farming land is.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, we'll give like a larger background on how you got into wine and all of that, but can you talk about your perspective on what you guys are trying to achieve with the Los Angeles River Wine Company, and maybe how you take what you used to do with the Scholium Project and how that is like fulfilling your mission in wine, or what you're really going for with each wine here?
Let me jump into the present and then work backwards to the origin. We've been making wine in Los Angeles since the 2019 harvest. And when we made wine that year, we had no idea what possible quality we could realize. And for me and for the people who were largely volunteers who worked with me, I think we were just trying to give it a shot. We thought, there are vineyards here that almost nobody knows about. It's amazing that they still exist. They deserve some attention, and they deserve an effort to make the best wine possible from them. But we didn't know what best possible even meant. And then come winter and spring, after the 2019 harvest, as the wines were maturing and approaching a time when we could consider bottling them, they really seemed pretty good. It seemed to us that with coming to know the vineyards better and maybe the best way to work with the fruit, that we had the potential to make some very serious wine. And I think I did not anticipate that. And I don't think anybody who joined me felt that way. So right now, what we feel like we're in the midst of, we're still very much at the beginning, coming to know the vineyards, trying to figure out when the best time to harvest them is, what the best way to work with the grapes, what the best practices are in the winery. But you could say now it's no longer a kind of experimental and exploratory. Instead, we feel like we're at the stage where we have good wine and maybe even very good wine. And by honing our own techniques, we feel like we have the possibility of making truly excellent wine. So that's what we're focused on now, is bringing up the level from a pretty consistent, very good. We're trying to get to pretty consistent excellence, so that nobody will have to say, wow, that's amazing. I had no idea you could make wine in Los Angeles. This is not bad. I want people to say something like, this is great, and then say, where is it from? And then be amazed, not coming at it from the Los Angeles side. And I'll just tell you one simple thing that we think is going to play a really big factor. We made really good wine in 2023, but as we were preparing that wine for bottling, we did 2 bottlings in March and then again in June. We really felt like that the wine was in danger of declining right before bottling. And we didn't really know why that was. Why were the wines in some way falling apart instead of getting stronger? And I've been making wine since 1999, and I know a fair amount. And I'd always, I think, been able to work with a really low level of, I don't know really how to put it, but I didn't have to sit on the wines. I didn't have to watch them. I didn't have to worry about them. Could really let them go in their own direction. And one of the things that I never thought too hard about was temperature. In 2019, 2020, 21, and then heading into the 2022 harvest, I'd never made wine in Los Angeles with any kind of temperature control. We really, in a way, put ourselves at the mercy of the wine gods and hoped that making wine in a really warm place without access to any refrigeration would not result in bad wines. And it never did. The wines were really good, and I never had to think twice about maybe they would be better if we had access to refrigeration. So last year, for the first time, we thought, no, one of the reasons that these wines are not hitting the highest level of quality is because we're not engaging in any temperature control. And I'm telling you this kind of long story because it's an absolutely basic thing. And so for me, it's interesting that I guess you could say I know so much about making wine. I've had so much experience. And in trying to figure out how to make the best possible wine in Los Angeles, I completely skipped something that is basic and taken seriously all over the world. But there's so many other things that are taken seriously and that are understood as absolutely necessary practices in the wine industry that I think deserve to be challenged and investigated. In other words, you can't take any of the received teaching for granted. I feel like you have to push everything. And one of the things that we've learned over the last few years is, at least for us in Los Angeles, we have to take temperature control seriously.
That makes a lot of sense. So are you talking about through the fermentation side of things, just to get nerdy? Or are you talking about when you're bringing the fruit in, or like when do you think it's most essential?
So we don't know the answer to that yet. And those are really good questions, but we have to consider that it's all of those. But if you remember, what brought this question to our attention was the sense that as the wines were maturing, that we had to watch them, that they weren't on their own maturing in the best possible way. And so what we feel pretty sure about is that during maturation, we have to have the wines in a kind of cooled area and not allow them to be Los Angeles room temperature. So not allow them during maturation to be 70 and 80 degrees, even if we're comfortable in the space at 70 to 80 degrees. And then we're going to investigate as another possibility then maybe we need to extend temperature control all the way to the very beginning. So in Napa, because it really was received teaching that especially to make a certain kind of aromatic white wine, you had to keep everything cold always, keep the fruit cold, keep the juice cold, keep the fermentation cold, and then keep the wine cool during aging. I took that for granted in Napa, did not implement it in Los Angeles. And now we're starting to feel that for sure during maturation, we need to keep the wine cool and maybe all the way from the very beginning. So we anticipate buying a fair amount of dry ice this year in order to chill the juice. Probably not do anything exceptional to chill the fruit itself, but to chill the juice going into fermentation, and then maybe also to use dry ice to keep the wine while it's fermenting at a moderately cool temperature. We just don't have access in the space that we're in this building built in 1912. We don't have access to something like a cold room. And I've thought about building one, but it would be too expensive. And we're so small that it would be, I think, really difficult to work in such a space. So for us, we feel like it makes more sense to chill the fermentations, not to chill the whole room.
That makes sense. And then when you're making these wines, because you guys are focused more on the vineyards themselves and letting them express themselves, these are all each individually fermented and bottled, right?
That's correct. We started this year in 2023 with the 2023 vintage, thinking ahead to making a blended white and a blended red also in addition to the single vineyard wines. We've experimented with blended reds before, mostly with juice that we thought wasn't of the very highest quality. So we wanted to exclude it from the single vineyard wines. Then we put it into a kind of kitchen sink. This year, for the first time, we're trying to make really excellent wines that are blended in the same way that people in Bordeaux and other places in the old world learned that they might be able to make the best possible wines by bringing in fruit from various sources rather than single vineyards. But we're not in any way giving up on the single vineyard. So this year, for instance, in 2023, I think we bottled 13 or 14 wines. And of those 13 or 14, 10 or 11 were single vineyard wines.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of your Cucamonga vineyards and some of the fruit? And then,
Absolutely. Yeah. The Cucamonga vineyards are fascinating, but in a really different way from Lone Wolf. And that's because most of them have been tended very carefully their whole lives. Maybe the single most impressive vineyard we work with is Lopez Zinfandel, which has been farmed by the Galanko family. I'm not sure how many years, but I think it's 3 generations of farming. The vineyard was planted by Miguel Lopez in 1918, and it was planted as a shipping or a packing vineyard. In other words, he planted it not to make wine from it in Los Angeles, but to put the fruit on trains and ship the fruit to the East Coast for home winemakers, mostly in New York and Philadelphia. And he did this in anticipation of prohibition because he and hundreds of other grape growers in California knew that there was going to be a provision allowing for home winemaking. And then they planned in advance to provide the fruit for the home winemakers. So Lopez, planted in 1918, farmed carefully its whole life, most of that life by the Galanko family. And it's an absolutely amazing vineyard where there's almost no unhealthy or weak vines, almost no misses, almost no places where a vine has died. So these vines are almost 100% survivors from 1918. They produce really beautiful fruit, small clusters, small berries. It's 100% Zinfandel in the Lopez Zinfandel. I think that that's true. I really don't think we've seen a single non-Zinfandel vine in the Zinfandel section. I'm drawing a distinction because there's another Lopez vineyard adjacent that's mostly Palomino. I'll come back to that. But it's the Zinfandel that for me is really the most amazing. One of the things that is crazy wonderful about the Cucamonga vineyards is that the growing conditions are so perfect that almost no farming needs to occur in them. And I can flesh that out in a positive way. Rather than telling you what doesn't get done, I can tell you what does get done. And that is, there's a single pass to prune the vineyards during the winter, and then a single pass to harvest the vineyards in late summer. And that is it. There's
That's
no
crazy.
tilling, no spraying, no shoot thinning, cluster thinning, no leafing. The vines are in perfect balance year after year. With the spring rains that we've had the last 2 years, we're seeing a tiny bit of mildew, but it's less mildew than one would see in a normal vineyard, even with very careful mildew abatement practices. So even with no mildew abatement, we're seeing less mildew than you'd expect to see in a normal vineyard. So that's the Zinfandel vineyard. The Palomino vineyard is a little bit older. It was planted in 1912, probably without any thought about prohibition, probably to make brandy and California sherry. And Palomino was moderately widely planted, but not really widely planted. And almost always planted to make those two products, to make brandy and to make sherry. This vineyard is not 100% Palomino. There are really interesting interlopers in it. We haven't done genetic analysis, but I think that there's French Colombard in the vineyard, maybe as much as even 5%. And I think that wouldn't be super shocking. And there's also about 1% red fruit. And the only thing that we've identified just by our own physical ampelography, no genetic analysis, is there's a tiny bit of Cinsault in the vineyard. We think that there are also other aromatic reds that were probably planted for the grape harvesters to eat during harvest. This vineyard was abandoned for almost 20 years of its life. And during that period, it wasn't pruned. So there's a large section of the Palomino vineyard that wasn't planted. I think roughly 2012, it wasn't pruned, roughly 2012 to 2023. And what's absolutely remarkable about this vineyard is with 1 year's pruning, that section of the vineyard has bounced back from being really stunted, where the vines look like bonsais and carried very little fruit, to producing about a ton per acre in the first year after pruning.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is absolutely amazing.
Yeah. So from those two vineyards, you guys, is that the same one you work with? You give some fruit to Raj too, the Palomino, or is that all that you make your own?
Well, so the Galianos farm and control both of them.
Oh, okay.
In 2021 was the first time I saw the Palomino vineyard, and it hadn't been pruned or harvested. I think that the front section of the vineyard hadn't been pruned in a year, and we don't know how long it had been since anything had been harvested, but it really looked like it'd been a few years since anything had been harvested. So that's 2021. In 2022, Raj and I and Scar of the Sea and Herman York got fruit from the vineyard. And then last year in 2023, it went in the course of just 3 years from nobody harvesting fruit to I think 7 wineries taking fruit from the vineyard in 2023.
Oh,
and
nice.
so that's all I would say due to the hard work and the generosity of the Galianos. And maybe I could be the point person. I guess you could say that, since we were the ones to help, you could say, rediscover the vineyard and get the Galianos back involved in it. But it's definitely not a question of my allowing anybody or giving the fruit to anybody. It's just like point of contact, something like that.
Oh, cool.
But yes, it is the same vineyard that Raj has made Palomino from.
Interesting. I'm glad. I hope it's not impacting your guys' ability to source at a certain price, but I'm glad that people are giving it the attention it deserves. And
it's generous of you to put the question that way, but no, not at all. What we're really hoping for is, both for the sake of this vineyard and so that the Galianos can be rewarded for being stewards of it, we do hope that there'll be a kind of competition for the fruit. We hope that the reputation of Cucamonga Palomino will become so strong that maybe we can't get everything we want, but really and truly, we think that will be the best thing for the grape growing world.
Yeah. Okay. I had that in the back of my head, but I was like, from a Los Angeles River Wine Company point of view, I was like, But that's two of the vineyards there. What are the other ones that you're working with? And are they this similar varieties? Or are they more like the mission
The
type?
Galanko's have a home ranch on land that they acquired in 1929. And my understanding is some of the vineyards on the home ranch had been planted before 29, and some of them had been planted by their family after 29. And we get fruit from the home ranch too. There's some intersection between what's planted in Lopez and what's planted in the Galliano home ranch. There's Palomino on the home ranch, also used for California sherry. There's Mission on the home ranch, also for California sherry. But what we're most interested in from the home ranch are the red grape varieties. So we've made good Palomino from the home ranch, but my sense is that the Palomino from Lopez is either more interesting or maybe, let's say it's not. It's just not clear whether we need to be making two single vineyard Palominos. So I'm putting everything on Lopez for now. The red fruit from Galliano is really interesting. There's two sections of the vineyard that, as far as we can tell, are both planted to Alicante, but the underlying geology of the two sections is really different. And we also think that the genetics of the two sections is different. There's one section of Alicante where the vines are bearing, let's say, 10 to 15 pounds per vine in a good year, make really dark, really intense wines, very tannic, pretty high acid. And then there's another section of the vineyard where the Alicante clearly has access to more underground water. And instead of being 10 or 15 pounds per plant, the vines, which are huge, can bear up to 150 pounds of fruit. It's absolutely amazing. But
Wow.
Here, the berries are large. And even though the fruit is very dark, it has a completely different character from the first Alicante section. And the wine is very floral and is much more like Cinsault, but it's clearly not Cinsault. It's really easy to tell that it's Alicante because it has dark juice and dark flesh, not just dark skins. But it makes these really beautiful aromatic wines. So from one section, we only make red wine, but from the other section, we make both Blanc de Noir and we make a red. And those are both really special.
Yeah. Have you seen, I guess we have had 2 rainy seasons in a row, but does the vines with more access to water perform better than the drier years, maybe 3 years ago? Or
I don't think we have enough knowledge to say, but we haven't seen any signs that the increased rainfall has led to something like less intensity. And I'll give you one example. The vines look a little healthier in Lopez and Zinfandel in the rainy years than they looked in the dry years. And there's less danger that the fruit is going to ripen too quickly. In other words, ripening takes place a little bit more slowly, even if it's been 3 months since it's rained. Those are both positive differences, but we don't really see a change in yield or a change in berry size in Lopez. In other words, Lopez has come to some kind of equilibrium within itself, and really beneficial winter rain and spring rain is not enough to throw off that equilibrium. On the other hand, in Lone Wolf, we have gone from harvesting, I think in our best year so far, we got almost 5 tons from 2 acres in Lone Wolf, but only during rainy years. And our worst year in one of the drought years was 1.5 tons. So Lone Wolf responds really, really differently than Lopez does. We don't see a difference in quality, but we do see a really large difference in the amount of fruit.
Interesting. I do want to, as we're getting closer to our time here, I want to talk a little bit more about like where people can find your wines and your vision moving forward with Los Angeles River Wine Co. But I wanted to ask, are there any other areas you guys are sourcing from? Is it mostly Cucamonga and Temecula? Are you guys still looking for more of these lost vineyards throughout Southern California? And then part 2, is there any kind of like interest in going down to Baja a little bit and just like straddling that line between Southern California fruit and Northern Mexican fruit as well?
Yeah, we think that the heritage of the vineyards is exactly the same. The vineyards in Baja are in some ways not just the brothers and sisters and cousins of the vineyards that we work with in Southern California, but they might be the parents and the grandparents of those vineyards. And so we really are eager to work with those vineyards. Tegan Passalacqua at Turley experimented with bringing fruit across the border to ferment it here. And he found that it was moderately complicated. So we're not sure that we're ever going to do that, truck fruit from the Baja into our winery in Los Angeles. But we really want to stay close to those vineyards and maybe even to participate in pruning and things like that. I would say low level of probability, but not zero, that we'll bring fruit from Mexico. There's a very small number of old vine vineyards in San Diego County, and I would love to become more familiar with those. But what's great is the fruit from those vineyards is really well known and well respected. And the wineries that control the vineyards make great wines that they sell out. So we were not going to try to pry any fruit away from them, but I would still like to get to know the vineyards better. And then lastly, whether they're more undiscovered vineyards in Southern California, we think not at this point. We think that in the few years we've been here, we've come to know every existing historical vineyard, but we also know that there are surprises lurking in unforeseen places. It took me 3 years to find the Palomino vineyard, and it's 30 acres. It's not like you could hide it. So given how long that took, we know that there could still be surprises out here, but they would be surprises. There's nothing that I've heard of that I haven't succeeded in finding.
That makes sense. And then just for everybody else's context, so Rancho Cucamonga is further east of Los Angeles. Temecula's in between San Diego and LA to the south. And there are some vineyards a little bit further north, like near Santa Clarita, and Malibu, I guess, has a little bit too. But is that most?
But I don't think any of them are historical vineyards. So this is related to the way you originally phrased the question. We're focused on, with Los Angeles River Wine Company, is exclusively historical vineyards. The youngest vineyard that we've worked with here is the Hofer Vineyard, which is a really remarkable vineyard, a really special place. But it's a vineyard planted in 1930, and it already feels like it's from a different era than Lopez planted in 1918. So we feel like I'm very interested in Santa Clarita as a grape growing area. And I for sure, let's say I can not just imagine, but I'm interested in making wine from those vineyards, but I don't think that would fit into the Los Angeles River Wine Company precisely because they're not historical vineyards. You know this, and some of your listeners know that I made wine under the Scholium Project label for about 20 years in Northern California before I started this. And from a combination of wanting to devote myself to beginning the winery down here, combination of that and the difficulties imposed by the pandemic, I really let Scholium contract as I have brought this winery into a healthy state. And we feel like the LA River Winery is now at a period of stability where I can start giving some attention back to the Northern California vineyards that I worked with during my Scholium years. And so just to tie Scholium, LA River, and then the other vineyards in Southern California together, if I found a really interesting vineyard in Southern California that was not a historical vineyard, then it would become part of Scholium.
That makes sense. Yeah, the only vineyard I'm really familiar with in that way is like the Swayze Vineyard, and I helped. Oh my gosh, his name's escaping me, but the Cavaletti Vineyards, pick some fruit, some Grenache up there, and then I made 100 pounds of Zinfandel in my bathtub when I first moved to LA. It's like my intro to LA. I still have 6 bottles. We'll see how it is. It's 6 years old now. Cool. So like now I want to wrap up, but I want to make sure people can find your wines. How can people? Do you only ship within California? Can you ship all over? Where should they go to find these? And
we're really just beginning to distribute the wines. We've maybe had them over the past couple of years in half dozen restaurants and maybe 1 or 2 retail locations. And we're really just beginning to get the wine to more locations. We had planned to spend some time this week showing wine in Los Angeles to restaurants and retailers, but harvest is going to begin perhaps as early as Wednesday or Thursday. So we're going to push back that sales launch. So for now, we sell most of the wine directly, either through the website or every so often somebody will visit us at the winery. And that is the major channel distribution for us. We'll sell a little bit wholesale, maybe to a half dozen states in the United States. We've got a couple foreign markets, including really strong support in Taiwan, for instance. But for now, I think people are just going to have to reach out to us. I'm really happy to say we're making a delivery to Felix tomorrow, who's going to pour 2 of our wines by the glass. I wish I had 6 other places to send people to. So come to us.
Nice. And then where is the winery again, just for people in LA?
The winery is near 15th and Santa Fe at 2079 East 15th. And there's for sure no sign, and you never know when we're going to be there. So you cannot drop by. Reach out to me and make an appointment.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for joining. This has been great. And I'm really excited we finally got to catch up. I've been waiting almost like 2 years to just chat with you. So this has been great.
Me too. I'm really grateful for your careful questions. Thanks so much.
All right. That was our interview with Abe Schoener. I hope everybody learned a little bit about Southern California wine history, something near and dear to my heart. And I hope everybody checks out Los Angeles River Wine Company. It's got a lot of cool things are going to be coming down the pipeline with them. And once you get your bottle there, you'll be able to explore a new bottle day after day with Coravin. The Coravin wine preservation systems make wine fun, accessible, and personal for all. Open your wine tasting to a world of possibilities, whether it be Southern California, the Southern Rhone. Coravin will help you drink those wines. And that is our episode for this week. We'll have another episode for you next week. Cheers.